Miss Abigail Wynne had resigned herself to spinsterhood until the day 6'6" Boaz Cutter darkened her schoolhouse doorway with 3 words that would shatter her carefully ordered world. "I need a wife," he declared without preamble, his deep voice resonating through her classroom like distant thunder, "and you need strong sons to guard your winters." Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The September wind carried the scent of dying grass across Red Fern Ridge, whipping through the wooden slats of the one-room schoolhouse where Miss Abigail Wynne had spent the better part of 8 years teaching arithmetic and reading to the children of ranchers and shopkeepers. The building groaned against the prairie gusts, its weathered boards bearing witness to countless seasons of harsh Wyoming weather. Abigail stood at the chalkboard, her brown hair pulled back in its usual tight bun, watching young Tommy Fletcher struggle with his multiplication tables. At 33, she had grown accustomed to the rhythm of her days. Rise before dawn, walk the quarter-mile from her small cottage to the schoolhouse, teach 10 to 20 odd children ranging from 6 to 14, then return home to the silence that had become her constant companion. 7 times 8, Tommy, she said gently, her voice carrying the patience that had made her beloved among the families of Red Fern Ridge. The boy's face scrunched in concentration, his tongue poking out slightly as he worked through the problem. 56, Miss Wynne, he finally answered. Very good, she smiled, the expression lighting up features that, while not conventionally beautiful, held a warmth that made people feel seen and valued. Her mother had always said Abigail's eyes were her finest feature, a soft hazel that seemed to change color with her moods, though they had grown more wistful with each passing year. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the wooden desks where her students bent over their slates. She had arranged the desks herself when she first arrived, spacing them just so to catch the best light. Everything in the schoolhouse bore her careful attention: the alphabet cards she had painted by hand, the small library of books she had purchased with her own meager savings, the pot-bellied stove she tended with the devotion of a mother caring for a child. This place had become more than her workplace. It was her refuge, her purpose, her identity. Here she was valued. Here she mattered. Here she was not just the spinster teacher, but Miss Wynne, who had taught the Carmichael boy to read despite his struggles, who had shown Mary Patterson that girls could be just as clever with numbers as boys, who had somehow managed to maintain order and learning in a frontier town where formal education was often seen as a luxury. As the children worked on their lessons, Abigail's gaze drifted to the window and the vast expanse of prairie beyond. The landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, rolling hills covered in buffalo grass, interrupted occasionally by stands of cottonwood trees that marked the path of hidden creeks. It was beautiful in its starkness, this land that demanded so much of those who chose to call it home. She had not chosen it, not really. 8 years ago, she had come to Red Fern Ridge as a young woman of 25, carrying little more than a teaching certificate and the desperate hope that distance might heal the wounds left by a broken engagement back in Ohio. Henry Morrison had been a banker's son, suitable and safe, and when he had asked for her hand, she had believed it was the beginning of the life she had always imagined for herself. But Henry had also been weak, susceptible to his father's disapproval, when it became clear that Abigail's family could offer no dowry, no connections, no advantage to their banking empire. The engagement had ended not with drama, but with a quiet conversation in her father's parlor, Henry's eyes unable to meet hers as he explained that perhaps they had been too hasty, that marriage was a serious business matter that required careful consideration of all factors. She had left Ohio 2 weeks later, responding to an advertisement for a school teacher in the Wyoming territory. Her parents had wept, begging her to reconsider. But Abigail had been determined to build a life on her own terms, free from the social expectations and matrimonial marketplace that had wounded her so deeply. Those first years had been hard. The isolation, the harsh winters, the loneliness that seemed to seep into her bones during the long nights when the wind howled across the prairie like a living thing. But gradually she had found her place. The children adored her. Their parents respected her, and she had carved out a small but meaningful existence in this corner of the frontier. Yet lately, as she watched her former students marry and start families of their own, as she attended christenings and birthday celebrations where she was always the maiden aunt figure, never the bride or mother, a familiar ache had begun to settle in her chest. She had made peace with spinsterhood, or so she told herself. But peace was not the same as happiness. The sound of boots on the wooden steps outside drew her attention back to the present. Parents sometimes came early to collect their children, especially when work on the ranches was pressing. She glanced at the clock, nearly 3:30. Soon she would dismiss the class and begin her solitary walk home. Miss Wynne, Sarah Mitchell, one of her brightest students, raised her hand. "I finished my arithmetic. May I help Tommy with his?" "Of course, dear." "That's very thoughtful of you." Abigail watched the 12-year-old girl move to sit beside the struggling boy, patiently explaining the multiplication process in the simple, direct way that children often manage better than adults. Sarah would make a fine teacher someday, Abigail thought, if her parents could be persuaded to let her continue her education beyond what was available in Redfern Ridge. The boots on the steps grew closer, and Abigail heard the distinctive jingle of spurs, definitely a rancher. She smoothed her gray wool skirt and prepared to greet whichever parent had come calling, perhaps to discuss their child's progress or to ask about additional tutoring. The door opened with its familiar creak, and a shadow fell across the threshold. But this was no ordinary shadow. It seemed to fill the entire doorway, broad-shouldered and imposing. Abigail looked up from her desk and felt her breath catch in her throat. Boaz Cutter stood in her schoolhouse, his black Stetson held respectfully in hands that seemed large enough to span the width of her desk. She had seen him before, of course. Redfern Ridge was small enough that everyone knew everyone else by sight, if not by conversation, but she had never been this close to the man who owned the largest ranch in 3 counties. He was enormous, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that had clearly been shaped by years of hard physical labor. His dark hair was streaked with premature silver at the temples, and his face bore the weathered lines of a man who spent his days under the prairie sun. But it was his eyes that struck her most, a deep brown that seemed to hold depth she could not fathom, gentle despite the intimidating frame that housed them. "Miss Wynne," he said, and his voice was exactly as she remembered from the few times she had heard him speak at church or town meetings, slow and rumbling like distant thunder on a summer evening. "Might I have a word with you?" The children had gone quiet, sensing the presence of one of the most powerful men in their small world. Tommy Fletcher's eyes were wide with a mixture of awe and nervousness. Boaz Cutter was the stuff of local legend, the man who could break horses with a whisper and who had once fought off a pack of wolves with nothing but a knife in his bare hands. "Of course, Mr. Cutter," Abigail managed, though her voice came out slightly higher than usual. "Children, please continue with your work quietly. I'll be just outside." She rose from her desk, suddenly conscious of how small she must appear next to this giant of a man. At 5'4", she was of average height for a woman, but Boaz Cutter made her feel positively tiny. She followed him onto the small porch outside the schoolhouse, closing the door behind her to give them privacy. The afternoon sun was warm on her face, but she felt a shiver run down her spine that had nothing to do with the weather. This was unprecedented. Boaz Cutter seeking her out, asking for a private conversation. In all her years in Redfern Ridge, they had exchanged perhaps a dozen words, mostly polite greetings at Sunday service. He stood with his back to the vast prairie, his presence somehow both calming and unsettling. There was something in his manner, a purposefulness, a gravity that suggested this was no casual visit to inquire about a neighbor child's education. "Miss Wynne," he began, then stopped, seeming to gather his thoughts. When he spoke again, his words were measured, deliberate. "I reckon you might think this strange, me coming here like this, but I've got something important to discuss with you." Abigail folded her hands in front of her, a gesture she had unconsciously adopted over the years when she felt nervous or uncertain. "I'm listening, Mr. Cutter." He looked at her directly then, those deep brown eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her heart skip. In the distance, she could hear the children's voices through the schoolhouse windows, the familiar sounds of learning and childhood that had formed the soundtrack of her adult life. "I need a wife," he said simply, as if he were discussing the weather or the price of cattle. "And you need strong sons to guard your winters." The words hit her like a physical blow, unexpected and overwhelming. She stared at him, certain she had misheard, but his expression remained steady, serious, waiting for her response to what was surely the most extraordinary statement anyone had ever made to her. In her jewelry box at home, hidden beneath the few modest pieces her mother had given her, lay her mother's wedding ring, the symbol of dreams she had long since abandoned. She had not looked at it in months, but suddenly she could picture it clearly, the simple gold band that represented everything she had convinced herself she no longer wanted. She began, then stopped, her mind reeling. "I'm not sure I understand what you're asking, Mr. Cutter." "I'm not asking," he replied, his voice gentle but firm. "I'm stating a fact. Two facts, actually. I've got a ranch that needs a woman's touch, and winter's coming hard this year. You've got nobody to look after you when the snow flies deep, and this town's got ideas about unmarried women that ain't getting any kinder with time." His directness was both shocking and somehow refreshing. No flowery speeches, no false promises, just honest assessment of their respective situations. It should have offended her, this reduction of marriage to mere practicality. But instead, she found herself listening, truly listening to what he was saying. "Mr. Cutter, I hardly know you," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "You know I'm honest," he replied. "You know I work hard and pay my debts. You know I've never been married and never had children, and you know this ranch could provide for you better than teaching school ever will." He paused, then added more softly, "And you know you're tired of being alone." That last observation struck her with painful accuracy. How had he seen what she had tried so hard to hide, even from herself? She felt heat rise in her cheeks and turned slightly away, looking out over the prairie that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The silence stretched between them, filled with the whisper of wind through the grass and the distant lowing of cattle. Inside the schoolhouse, she could hear Sarah Mitchell's patient voice explaining fractions to the younger children. This was her world, her carefully constructed life of purpose and independence, and this man was asking her to leave it all behind for something she could not even fully comprehend. "I don't understand why you've come to me," she said at last. "Surely there are younger women, unmarried women who would—" "I don't want a girl," he interrupted not unkindly. "I want a woman who knows her own mind, who's faced life and not run from it. I want someone I can talk to when the work's done, someone who can hold her own in this country." He gestured toward the schoolhouse. "You've been doing that for 8 years. That tells me what I need to know about your character." Abigail felt something flutter in her chest. Not quite hope, but something close to it. When had anyone last spoken to her as if she were valuable for reasons beyond her usefulness as an unmarried woman who could teach their children? When had anyone seen her as more than just the spinster schoolteacher, deserving of pity and patronizing kindness? "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Cutter?" she asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Marriage," he said simply. "A partnership. I won't lie to you and say it's about love. I don't know much about that particular sentiment, but I know about respect, and I know about taking care of what's mine. You'd have a good home, security, position as my wife, and in time," he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully, "in time, maybe we'd find something more than just convenience in each other's company." The honesty of it was breathtaking. No pretty words, no false promises of passion and romance, just a practical arrangement between two adults who understood the realities of frontier life. And yet there was something in his manner, something in the way he looked at her that suggested depths beneath the pragmatic surface. "I would need time to consider," she said finally. "Of course." He placed his hat back on his head, the gesture somehow making him seem even larger, more commanding. "But don't take too long, Miss Wynne. Winter's coming whether we're ready or not, and some decisions get harder the longer you wait to make them." He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of farewell, then stepped off the porch and walked toward his horse, a massive bay gelding that seemed to be the only creature in Redfern Ridge that could carry his weight with ease. Abigail watched him mount with the fluid grace of a man born to the saddle, then ride away across the prairie, his figure growing smaller until it disappeared into the vast landscape that had shaped them both. She stood on the porch for a long moment, her hand resting on the railing, her mind churning with the impossibility of what had just occurred. Inside the schoolhouse, the children continued their lessons, unaware that their teacher's carefully ordered world had just been turned upside down by a proposition as unexpected as it was practical. When she finally returned to her classroom, Sarah Mitchell looked up with bright, curious eyes. "Was that about one of us, Miss Wynne? Are we in trouble?" "No, dear," Abigail replied, her voice surprisingly calm. "Nothing like that at all." But as she watched her students work, as she went through the familiar motions of teaching and guiding and encouraging, her mother's wedding ring seemed to burn in her memory, a reminder of dreams she had thought were safely buried, but which Boaz Cutter's unexpected visit had somehow stirred back to life. That evening, Abigail sat at her small kitchen table, staring at the marriage contract Boaz Cutter had left with her, a simple document that outlined their arrangement with the same straightforward honesty he had shown in person. The paper lay before her like a bridge between two different lives, one familiar and safe, the other unknown and full of possibility. The contract was handwritten in a careful masculine script that surprised her. She had expected something crude befitting a rough rancher, but the penmanship was educated, thoughtful. The terms were fair, more than fair. She would keep her teaching position if she desired, have her own household allowance, maintain separate quarters initially, and be treated with the respect due a wife in all public matters. "Marriage of practical convenience," she read aloud, the words echoing in her empty cottage. "Between Boaz Cutter and Abigail Wynne, entered into for mutual benefit and protection, with the understanding that affection may grow, but is not required for the fulfillment of marital duties." The clinical language should have repelled her, but instead she found it oddly comforting. No false promises, no deceptions about love at first sight, just two adults making a sensible decision about their futures. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She folded the contract quickly, though she wasn't sure why she felt the need to hide it. Through the window, she could see Mrs. Henderson from the Mercantile, her round face creased with concern. "Abigail, dear," the older woman said when she opened the door. "I hope you don't mind me calling so late, but I heard the most extraordinary thing at the store today." "Please come in." Abigail stepped aside, knowing that whatever Mrs. Henderson had heard would be all over town by morning. "Would you like some tea?" "That would be lovely." Mrs. Henderson settled herself in the tiny parlor, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of Abigail's modest home. "Now then, Is it true that Boaz Cutter came to see you at the school today? Word traveled fast in a town of 300 souls. Abigail busied herself with the tea kettle, buying time to think. Mr. Cutter did stop by, yes. And Mrs. Henderson's voice carried the eager anticipation of someone who thrived on being the first to know the latest news. What did he want? Abigail poured the tea carefully, her hand steady despite the turmoil in her mind. He had a proposition for me. What sort of proposition? The older woman leaned forward, her eyes bright with curiosity. There was no point in trying to keep it secret. By tomorrow, everyone would know anyway. Small towns had their own mysterious ways of spreading information. Better to control the narrative herself. He asked me to marry him, Abigail said simply. Mrs. Henderson's teacup clattered against its saucer. Marry him, Boaz Cutter, but he's never shown interest in any woman. Not in all the years he's been here, and you've never... you two barely know each other. That's what I told him, Abigail replied, settling into her chair with her own cup. He said it was a practical arrangement. He needs a wife, and I need... She paused, the words sticking in her throat. Security. The older woman stared at her in amazement. And what did you tell him? I told him I would consider it. Mrs. Henderson set down her tea entirely, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern. Abigail, dear, I know the winters are hard on you, living alone out here. But marriage to a man you don't love. Are you sure this is wise? The question hung in the air between them. Was it wise? By conventional standards, certainly not, but conventional standards had not served her particularly well so far. What would you have me do, Mrs. Henderson? Abigail asked quietly. I'm 33 years old. I have no family, no prospects, and every year that passes makes it less likely that I'll find a traditional marriage. Mr. Cutter is offering me a chance at a different kind of life. But he's so... Mrs. Henderson gestured vaguely, searching for words. Imposing, intimidating. All those stories about his strength, his temper when crossed. Aren't you afraid? Abigail considered the question seriously. She had been aware of Boaz's reputation, the stories of his physical prowess, his success with the ranch, the way other men deferred to him. But in their brief conversation, she had seen something else beneath the intimidating exterior. He was gentle with me, she said finally, respectful, honest about what he could offer and what he expected in return. There are worse things than marrying a good man who deals fairly. Mrs. Henderson shook her head, clearly unconvinced. The whole town will be talking about this. Some will say you're being practical, but others... She left the sentence hanging. Others will say I'm desperate, Abigail finished. Perhaps they're right, but perhaps being desperate isn't always a bad thing if it leads you to make a necessary change. After Mrs. Henderson left, Abigail returned to the contract. She read it through 3 more times, considering each clause, each implication. The marriage would take place within 2 weeks if she agreed. She would move to his ranch but could maintain the schoolhouse as long as she wished. He would provide for her material needs and protect her as his wife. In return, she would manage his household and, in time, hopefully bear his children. The next morning brought a parade of visitors, each more curious than the last. By noon, it seemed half the town had found reasons to stop by the schoolhouse or her cottage. The reactions were predictably mixed. Some shocked, some envious, some disapproving. I think it's romantic, declared Mary Patterson, one of her former students, who had married young and now had 3 children of her own. Like something from a storybook, the mysterious rancher and the school teacher. I think it's scandalous, countered Mrs. Hartwell, the preacher's wife. Marriage should be based on love and Christian devotion, not mere convenience. Dr. Morrison, no relation to her former fiancé, took a more practical view. Boaz Cutter is a good man, if a solitary one. He's honest, hardworking, and prosperous. You could do worse, Abigail. But it was 8-year-old Tommy Fletcher who provided the most compelling argument. When she walked him home after school, he looked up at her with serious blue eyes and asked, "Miss Wynne, are you really going to marry Mr. Cutter?" "I'm thinking about it, Tommy." "Why?" "Because he fixed our fence when Papa hurt his back, and he didn't ask for nothing in return, and he let me pet his horse once. His hands are real big, but he was gentle with the horse." The boy paused. "Mama says gentle hands mean a gentle heart." That evening, Abigail found herself standing at her window, looking out at the prairie as the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold. The vastness of the landscape never failed to move her, its beauty and its harshness intertwined like lovers locked in an eternal dance. She thought about the life she had built here, the careful routines that had sustained her through 8 years of solitude. It was a good life, respectable and useful, but it was also limited. She was 33 years old, and the dreams she had carried from Ohio, a husband, children, a home filled with laughter and love, had slowly withered like flowers in a drought. But what if they didn't have to wither? What if, instead of the romantic love she had once imagined, there could be something else: partnership, respect, shared purpose? Boaz Cutter was offering her the chance to find out. She retrieved the contract from her kitchen drawer and read it one final time. Then, with steady hands, she signed her name at the bottom: Abigail Wynne, soon to become Abigail Cutter. The act felt both momentous and surprisingly simple, like stepping across a threshold into a room she had never seen but somehow always known was waiting for her. Tomorrow she would find Boaz and give him her answer. Tonight she would pack away her mother's wedding ring and prepare to discover what kind of life could be built on honesty instead of romance, on practical partnership instead of passionate love. The contract lay on her table, signed and sealed, a bridge between her careful past and her uncertain future. Outside, the prairie wind whispered through the grass, carrying with it the promise of change. The morning Abigail delivered her signed contract to Boaz Cutter's ranch, she carried her teaching slate with her, a worn piece of smooth stone that had been her constant companion for 8 years. It seemed fitting somehow, this symbol of her independence accompanying her as she took the first step toward a very different kind of life. The Cutter ranch house sat in a natural depression between 2 low hills, protected from the worst of the prairie winds, but positioned to catch the morning sun. It was larger than she had expected, a solid log structure with a wide front porch and several outbuildings that spoke of prosperity and careful planning. As she approached, she could see Boaz working near the corral, his massive frame unmistakable even at a distance. He looked up as she drew near, setting aside the bridle he had been mending and walking toward her with that easy, ground-covering stride she had noticed before. He was bareheaded in the morning sun, his dark hair catching glints of silver, and there was something about his expression, a mixture of hope and uncertainty, that made her realize this arrangement mattered to him more than his practical words had suggested. "Miss Wynne," he said, touching his hat brim in greeting, "I wasn't expecting you so early." "I wanted to speak with you before the school day began," she replied, drawing the folded contract from her reticule. "I've made my decision." His eyes dropped to the paper in her hands, and she saw his jaw tighten slightly. Whether from anticipation or anxiety, she couldn't tell. When he looked back at her face, his expression was carefully neutral. Instead of answering with words, she handed him the signed contract. She watched as his eyes scanned the document, pausing at her signature at the bottom. When he looked up again, something had changed in his expression, softening, as if a tension he had been carrying for days had finally released. "You're certain about this?" he asked quietly. "As certain as anyone can be about the unknown," she replied. "I have conditions, Mr. Cutter." "Boaz," he corrected gently. And I expected you would. What are they? She had rehearsed this conversation during the long walk to his ranch, but now, standing before this imposing man who would soon be her husband, the words felt awkward on her tongue. I want to continue teaching, at least for now. The children depend on me, and I need to know that I can still be useful in that way. Agreed. What else? Separate bedrooms initially. Sensible, he interrupted. We're strangers entering a practical arrangement. There's no rush to complicate things beyond what they already are. His easy acceptance of her terms surprised her. She had expected some resistance, some assertion of husbandly rights. Instead, he was treating her conditions with the same practical consideration he had shown throughout their brief acquaintance. Is there anything else? He asked. She looked down at the teaching slate in her hands, its smooth surface worn from years of lessons and demonstrations. I want your word that you'll respect the person I am now, not try to change me into someone you think a wife should be. Boaz was quiet for a long moment, his eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed, vulnerable. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. Abigail, he said, and the sound of her given name in his deep voice sent an unexpected shiver through her. I asked you to marry me because of who you are, not despite it. I don't want a different woman. I want you. The simple honesty of the statement hit her like a physical blow. When had anyone last wanted her specifically, particularly for herself, rather than for what she could provide or represent? The feeling was overwhelming and terrifying and wonderful all at once. 2 weeks, he continued, his voice returning to its practical tone. Will that give you enough time to make arrangements with the school board about continuing your teaching? Yes, she managed, though her voice came out slightly breathless. Yes, I think so. Good. I'll speak with Reverend Matthews about the ceremony. Nothing fancy, just the legal requirements and a few witnesses. She nodded, then found herself hesitating. There was so much they hadn't discussed, so many practical details that would need to be worked out. Boaz, she said, testing his name on her tongue and finding it fit better than she had expected. What do you expect from me day to day? I mean, I've lived alone for 8 years. I don't know how to be a wife. A ghost of a smile touched the corners of his mouth. I don't know how to be a husband either. I figure we'll learn together. The simplicity of it was both reassuring and daunting. No grand romantic gestures, no passionate declarations, just two people agreeing to figure out life together as they went along. She spent the next 2 weeks in a strange suspension between her old life and her new one. The townspeople watched her with a mixture of fascination and concern, as if she were a fascinating specimen of womanhood gone slightly mad. Some of the women tried to advise her on marriage, offering tips on cooking and household management that assumed she knew nothing about running a home. Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife, took it upon herself to educate Abigail about wifely duties, speaking in euphemisms that would have been amusing if they hadn't been so mortifying. Other women shared their own marriage stories, some happy, some cautionary, all delivered with the air of women welcoming a new member to their mysterious sisterhood. The men were simpler in their reactions. They either congratulated her on making a good match or looked at her with the peculiar mixture of pity and bewilderment that men reserved for women who made choices they couldn't understand. Through it all, Abigail continued teaching, holding her classes, and tending to her students with the same dedication she had always shown. The teaching slate became her anchor, its familiar weight in her hands reminding her that regardless of what else might change, she was still Miss Wynne, educator and guardian of young minds. It was young Sarah Mitchell who asked the question that had been haunting Abigail's own thoughts. Miss Wynne, after you get married, will you still be our teacher? For as long as you need me and I'm able, Abigail replied, though even as she said the words, she wondered if she was making a promise she might not be able to keep. "Will you have babies?" asked little Emma Cole, with the frank curiosity of childhood. The question sent heat flooding through Abigail's cheeks. Children, that had been part of Boaz's original proposition, the promise of strong sons to guard her winters. The thought of bearing his children, of creating life with this man she barely knew, was both thrilling and terrifying. "Perhaps," she said carefully. "Someday." As the wedding day approached, Abigail found herself caught between anticipation and panic. She had no wedding dress. Such luxuries seemed inappropriate for a marriage of convenience, but she did have a good blue wool dress that brought out her eyes. It would have to do. The night before the ceremony, she sat in her cottage for what might be the last time as a single woman, her teaching slate propped against the lamp on her table. Tomorrow she would become Mrs. Boaz Cutter, mistress of one of the largest ranches in 3 counties. The transformation seemed impossible to believe. She thought about the dreams she had carried as a young woman. Romantic notions of courtship and passionate love, of being swept off her feet by a man who would adore her above all else. Those dreams belonged to someone else now. Someone younger and more innocent. Someone who hadn't yet learned that life rarely matched the stories in books. But perhaps there were different kinds of dreams, more practical ones that could still lead to happiness. Perhaps partnership and respect could grow into something deeper, more lasting than the fleeting passion she had once imagined. The teaching slate caught the lamplight, its surface reflecting her face back at her in wavering, uncertain lines. Tomorrow she would discover what kind of woman she would become as Boaz Cutter's wife. Tonight she was still Abigail Wynn, schoolteacher, independent and alone, but no longer entirely resigned to remaining so. Outside her window, the prairie stretched endlessly toward the horizon, vast and challenging and full of possibilities she had never allowed herself to imagine. The wedding ceremony took place on a crisp October morning in Reverend Matthew's small church, with only a handful of witnesses present. Abigail wore her blue wool dress and carried a simple bouquet of prairie wildflowers that Boaz had surprised her with. Purple asters and golden black-eyed Susans that he had gathered himself from the hills surrounding his ranch. As they stood before the altar, she was acutely aware of the vast size difference between them. Her hand felt tiny in his, as they exchanged vows that were practical rather than poetic, promising to care for each other in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, but making no mention of love or cherishing. It was exactly what they had agreed upon, yet something in Abigail's chest ached for the words that weren't spoken. When Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, Boaz lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, a gesture so unexpectedly tender that it brought tears to her eyes. Then it was over, and she was Mrs. Cutter, bound to a man she had known for less than a month. The ride to the ranch house in Boaz's wagon was quiet, filled with the awkward silence of 2 people who had just committed their lives to each other without really knowing what that commitment would mean in practice. Abigail kept her hands folded in her lap, clutching the wildflower bouquet and trying to calm the butterflies that had taken up residence in her stomach. "Nervous?" Boaz asked as they approached the house. "Yes," she admitted. "You?" "Yes," he replied, and somehow his honesty made her feel better. The ranch house looked different as they approached. Not just a building she was visiting, but her home now. Boaz had clearly made an effort to prepare for her arrival. The windows sparkled, the porch had been swept clean, and there were fresh curtains hanging in the front windows that definitely hadn't been there during her previous visit. He helped her down from the wagon with careful hands, his touch lingering just a moment longer than necessary. "I've prepared a room for you," he said, lifting her small trunk of belongings. "Upstairs, facing east, so you'll catch the morning light." The interior of the house was surprisingly comfortable and well-appointed. The main room featured a large stone fireplace, comfortable chairs, and to her amazement, a substantial bookshelf filled with volumes she wouldn't have expected a rancher to own. Her eyes widened as she took in titles by Shakespeare, Dickens, and Emerson. "You're surprised," Boaz observed, following her gaze. "I am," she admitted. "That I could read?" There was amusement in his voice rather than offense. "My mother was a teacher before she married my father. She insisted on education, even for a boy who seemed destined for ranch work." This revelation shifted something in Abigail's understanding of the man she had just married. She had assumed he was uneducated despite the careful handwriting on their marriage contract. The discovery that they shared a love of books created an unexpected bridge between them. "I brought some of my own books," she said hesitantly. "I hope that's all right." "More than all right." He gestured toward the bookshelf. "I had hoped you might add to the collection." He showed her through the house, the large kitchen with its modern stove, the dining room that could seat 8, the parlor with its upright piano that he admitted he couldn't play but had inherited from his mother. Everything was clean and well maintained, but had the unmistakable air of a home occupied by a solitary man. It needed a woman's touch, flowers and small decorations, and the kind of comfortable lived-in feeling that came from shared daily life. Her room was on the second floor, spacious and pleasant, with windows that looked out over the rolling hills she had grown to love during her years in Red Fern Ridge. He had placed a small writing desk by the window and arranged her few belongings on the dresser with touching care. "I thought you might like to have space for your school preparations," he said, indicating the desk. "And there's a lamp with good light for reading." The thoughtfulness of these arrangements surprised her. This was not the casual gesture of a man fulfilling an obligation, but the careful preparation of someone who had given serious thought to her comfort and needs. "I want you to be happy here, Abigail," he said quietly. "This arrangement, it benefits me greatly, and I don't want you to feel you've gotten the lesser end of the bargain." That evening, they shared their first meal as husband and wife, beef stew and fresh bread that he had prepared himself, another surprise in a day full of them. The conversation was stilted at first, two strangers feeling their way toward some kind of comfortable interaction. "Tell me about your students," he said as they ate. "Which ones give you the most trouble?" She found herself relaxing as she talked about Tommy Fletcher's struggles with arithmetic and Sarah Mitchell's exceptional abilities, about the challenges of teaching children with such wide age ranges and varying levels of preparation. He listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions and making observations that showed he understood more about education than she had expected. "You're good with them," he said when she finished describing a particularly difficult day with the younger children. "It shows in how they talk about you in town. Their parents respect you, trust you with their children. That's not easy to earn in a place like this." The compliment warmed her more than she had expected. In return, she asked about the ranch, and he told her about the challenges of raising cattle on the prairie, constant concerns about weather and disease, the delicate balance between grazing and conservation, the satisfaction of building something lasting on unforgiving land. After dinner, he excused himself to tend to the evening chores while she explored her new home more thoroughly. The kitchen was well stocked and organized, though clearly arranged by a man who cooked for necessity rather than pleasure. The parlor contained evidence of solitary evenings, a half-finished chess puzzle, several books with markers indicating recent reading, a comfortable chair positioned to catch the firelight. When he returned, he found her examining the bookshelf more closely. "Find anything interesting?" he asked. "You have excellent taste in literature," she replied, pulling out a volume of Tennyson. "This is one of my favorites." "Mine too," he said, moving to stand beside her. "Particularly Ulysses. There's something about the idea of always pushing toward the unknown that appeals to me." She looked up at him in surprise. "That's exactly what I love about it. the notion that it's never too late to seek new experiences, to become something different than what you've always been. For a moment they stood there in comfortable silence, and Abigail felt something shift between them. A recognition of shared understanding, perhaps, or simply the first tentative step toward genuine companionship. "I should let you get settled," he said finally. "Tomorrow will be a busy day. I have work to do on the north fence, and you'll want to prepare for your classes." "Will you mind having a wife who continues to work outside the home?" she asked, suddenly uncertain about this aspect of their arrangement. "I'll be proud to have a wife who's respected for her mind and her abilities," he replied without hesitation. "Most men around here can't say their wives contribute to the community the way you do." Later, as she prepared for bed in her new room, Abigail reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. This morning, she had been Miss Wynne, spinster schoolteacher. Tonight, she was Mrs. Cutter, married to a man who read Tennyson and arranged wildflower bouquets and thought carefully about where to place a writing desk for optimal light. It wasn't love, not yet, perhaps not ever in the passionate sense she had once imagined, but it was something more than mere convenience, something that hinted at possibilities she hadn't dared to consider when she signed their practical contract. Outside her window, the prairie stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars. And for the first time in 8 years, Abigail fell asleep in a house where she wasn't alone. 3 weeks into their marriage, Abigail found herself kneeling in the cold earth behind the ranch house, her hands deep in soil as she planted the kitchen garden seeds that Boaz had surprised her with. The small paper packets, carrots, beans, lettuce, herbs, represented something more than just practical provisions for the coming year. They were a symbol of permanence, of putting down roots, of building a future together that extended beyond mere convenience. "You don't have to do that," Boaz said, approaching from the barn where he'd been tending to a mare with an injured hoof. "I can hire someone from town to plant a garden." "I want to do it," Abigail replied, sitting back on her heels and pushing a loose strand of hair from her face. "I've never had space for more than a few herbs before. This feels hopeful." The word hung between them, laden with meaning. Neither of them quite knew how to address directly. Hope suggested expectations beyond their practical arrangement, feelings that went deeper than mutual convenience. Their daily routine had settled into a comfortable rhythm over the past weeks. Abigail rose early to prepare breakfast, walked to the schoolhouse for her classes, then returned in the afternoon to find Boaz usually working somewhere on the property. Evenings were spent quietly, she grading papers or reading, while he tended to ranch business or worked on small repairs. They talked more easily now, sharing observations about the weather, the livestock, her students, his work. But there were moments, fleeting instances when their hands brushed as she passed him his coffee, or when she caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret that suggested something more complex developing between them. "I spoke with Marcus Blackwood yesterday," Boaz said, settling onto his heels beside her and examining the neat rows she had marked out for planting. "He's been asking questions about our marriage." Abigail's hands stilled in the soil. Marcus Blackwood owned the ranch adjacent to theirs, a man known for his ambition and his resentment of Boaz's success. She had seen him at church, a handsome man in his 40s with calculating eyes and a smile that never seemed to reach them. "What kind of questions?" "Whether it's a real marriage or just a legal arrangement to help you maintain respectability." Boaz's voice was carefully neutral, but she could hear the tension beneath it. "He seems to think a woman like you wouldn't willingly tie herself to a man like me unless there was some kind of desperation involved." The words stung, not because they were entirely wrong, but because they reduced their growing partnership to something sordid and pathetic. Abigail found herself bristling with unexpected protectiveness, not just for herself, but for Boaz and the dignified way he had approached their unconventional arrangement. "What did you tell him?" she asked. "I told him our marriage was none of his business," Boaz replied, but his eyes remained fixed on the garden soil rather than meeting her gaze. "But it got me thinking about appearances, about what people expect from a married couple." Abigail understood what he was driving at. They lived together like polite strangers, sharing space and meals but maintaining a careful distance that was becoming increasingly noticeable to their neighbors. At church, they sat together but rarely touched. In town, they were cordial but not affectionate. To outside observers, they must seem like exactly what Blackwood suspected: two people locked in a marriage of pure convenience. "Are you concerned about what people think?" she asked. "I'm concerned about what it might mean for you," he replied, finally looking at her. "If people start believing this isn't a real marriage, it could affect how they see you as a teacher. Some of the more conservative families might not want their children taught by a woman in a questionable situation." The possibility hadn't occurred to her, but she could see the logic in his concern. Her reputation was crucial to her ability to continue teaching, and anything that cast doubt on her moral character could undermine years of hard work building trust with the community. "What do you suggest?" she asked. For a moment he looked almost shy. This massive man who could break horses and face down prairie storms without flinching. "We could make more of an effort to appear like a typical married couple in public. I mean small things that married people do, such as my taking your arm when we walk together, sitting closer in church, maybe." He paused, his cheeks actually coloring slightly. "Maybe you could call me something other than Mr. Cutter when other people are around." The suggestion was so modest, so reasonable, that Abigail almost smiled, but there was something vulnerable in his expression that kept her from treating it lightly. This man, who had approached their marriage with such practical directness, was asking for permission to act like her husband in public, clearly finding the request more difficult than he had expected. "I think that would be wise," she said carefully. "For both our sakes." Relief flickered across his features. "Good, that's good." They worked in the garden together for the next hour, their conversation turning to safer topics like which vegetables grew best in prairie soil and how to protect tender plants from unexpected late frosts. But Abigail was aware of a shift between them, subtle but significant. The boundaries of their relationship were expanding, even if only in small, careful increments. That Sunday at church, she slipped her hand through his arm as they walked up the steps, feeling the solid strength of him beneath her palm. During the service, she sat close enough that their shoulders occasionally brushed, and when Reverend Matthews asked the congregation to greet their neighbors, Boaz placed his hand gently on the small of her back, a touch so light she might have imagined it, but possessive enough to be noticed by anyone watching. The change in people's reactions was immediate and gratifying. Mrs. Patterson smiled approvingly, nodding as if some question in her mind had been settled. Even Marcus Blackwood, seated 2 pews ahead with his own wife, turned to look at them during the service, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in their new closeness. After church, as they stood outside talking with other parishioners, Dr. Morrison complimented Boaz on how happy Abigail looked. "Marriage agrees with her," the older man observed, and Boaz's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on her arm. "Thank you," Boaz replied, his voice carrying a note of quiet pride that made Abigail's heart skip. "I'm a fortunate man." The words were perfectly appropriate for public consumption, but when he looked down at her as he said them, she saw something in his eyes that went beyond mere performance. There was genuine warmth there, perhaps even affection, and the discovery sent a flutter of something, hope, attraction, possibility, through her chest. Walking home from church, their new public intimacy felt both natural and strange. She found herself acutely aware of his presence beside her, the way he shortened his stride to match hers, The protective way he guided her around puddles and rough spots in the road. "Thank you," she said as they approached the ranch house. "For what?" "For caring about my reputation, about my teaching. I know this isn't the kind of marriage you might have chosen if circumstances were different." He stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious. "Abigail," he said, and her name in his deep voice still sent that small thrill through her. "I need you to understand something. I didn't ask you to marry me because I had no other choice. I asked you because I wanted you specifically, the woman who's been teaching the children of this town for 8 years, who reads Tennyson and plants gardens and speaks her mind when something matters to her." The intensity of his words, the conviction behind them, left her momentarily speechless. This was not the distant, practical arrangement she had signed up for. This was something deeper, more personal, more frightening and wonderful than she had allowed herself to imagine. "I wanted you too," she said quietly, the admission surprising her with its truth. "Not just the security, not just the respectability. You, the man who reads poetry and builds bookshelves and treats marriage contracts like sacred documents." They stood there on the path to their house, looking at each other with a new understanding, a recognition that their carefully practical arrangement was evolving into something neither of them had expected, but both were beginning to want. That evening, as they sat in the parlor after dinner, Abigail found herself stealing glances at her husband as he read. The lamplight caught the silver threads in his dark hair, and there was something peaceful about his expression that made her think of the contentment she felt working in their garden together. The kitchen garden seeds lay planted in neat rows behind their house, waiting for spring rain and sunshine to bring them to life. Like their marriage, she realized, something that had begun with practical necessity but was slowly, carefully growing into something more nourishing and sustaining than either of them had dared to hope. The threat from Marcus Blackwood materialized on a gray November morning when he arrived at the ranch with 2 hired men and a surveyor, claiming that Boaz's north pasture actually belonged to him, according to recently discovered property records. Abigail watched from the kitchen window as the confrontation unfolded, her hands gripping the edge of the sink until her knuckles went white. Boaz stood in the yard, calm but unmistakably dangerous, as Blackwood gestured toward the disputed land. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in her husband's shoulders, the careful way he held himself when anger was building beneath his controlled exterior. When the men finally left, Boaz came inside and sat heavily at the kitchen table, his father's pocket watch in his hands. It was an old silver timepiece, worn smooth from years of handling, and Abigail had never seen him with it before. "My father carried this for 30 years, he said quietly, his thumb tracing the intricate engravings on its surface. "He was working the north pasture when he died, found him there with this watch still ticking in his vest pocket." Abigail moved to sit across from him, drawn by the pain in his voice. In all their weeks of marriage, he had rarely spoken of his family, maintaining the same careful privacy about his past that he showed in all things. "How did he die?" she asked gently. "Heart attack," the doctor said, "but he was only 42, strong as an ox." Boaz's jaw tightened. "I always wondered if there was more to it." He'd been having disputes with Blackwood about water rights, grazing boundaries. My father was trusting. He believed men settled their differences with words, not weapons. The implication hung heavy in the air between them. Abigail felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November wind rattling the windows. "You think Blackwood had something to do with your father's death?" "I think Marcus Blackwood is the kind of man who sees what he wants and finds ways to take it, regardless of who gets hurt in the process." Boaz closed the watch with a sharp click. "He's been circling this ranch like a vulture ever since my father died, looking for any excuse to claim pieces of it. What did he want today?" the North Pasture, claims he has a deed that predates ours by 5 years. Boaz's voice carried a bitter edge. Convenient that this deed should surface just now, when I have a wife to consider, when I'm not just responsible for myself anymore. The protective note in his voice sent warmth through Abigail's chest, even as fear settled like a cold stone in her stomach. She was beginning to understand that their marriage had made them both targets, because she was now tied to Boaz's property and prosperity, him because he now had something precious that could be threatened. "What can we do?" she asked. "Fight it legally for now. Get our own surveyor out there, examine the documents." He looked at her directly, and she saw something she had never seen before in his steady brown eyes: uncertainty, perhaps even fear. "But Abigail, I need you to understand what you've gotten yourself into by marrying me. This could get dangerous." "Are you trying to frighten me away?" she asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I'm trying to give you the chance to leave before things get worse." The words stung more than she had expected. After weeks of growing closeness, of tentative affection blooming between them, he was still thinking of their marriage as something she might want to escape from. "And go where?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "Back to my cottage. Back to being pitied as the spinster who couldn't even make a marriage of convenience work. You could leave Red Fern Ridge entirely. Start over somewhere else. I'd make sure you had enough money to—" "Stop." The word came out with such force that Boaz actually leaned back in his chair. "Just stop. Do you think I'm the kind of woman who runs at the first sign of trouble? Do you think 8 years of teaching frontier children, of surviving prairie winters alone, of building a life in this harsh country has left me so delicate that I can't handle a land dispute? I think you're brave and strong and deserving of a peaceful life," he replied quietly. "I think you've already sacrificed enough for other people's needs, and you shouldn't have to sacrifice your safety for mine." The gentleness in his voice deflated her anger as quickly as it had risen. This wasn't about doubting her strength. It was about his unwillingness to put her in danger, his need to protect what had become precious to him. "Boaz," she said, reaching across the table to cover his hands with hers. The touch seemed to surprise them both. It was the first time she had initiated physical contact between them. "I'm not going anywhere. This is my home now, our home. Whatever comes, we'll face it together." He turned his hands palm up, capturing hers in his much larger ones. The calluses on his fingers told the story of years of hard work, and she found herself tracing them with her thumbs, marveling at the gentleness of which these strong hands were capable. "I've never had anyone to protect before," he admitted. "Never had anyone whose safety mattered more than my own. It's terrifying." The confession was so honest, so vulnerable, that it took her breath away. This man, who seemed strong enough to wrestle bears, was afraid, not for himself, but for her. "You're not alone anymore," she said softly. "We protect each other." That night, for the first time since their wedding, they sat together on the parlor sofa instead of in separate chairs. It was a small thing, but significant. Another boundary crossed, another step toward genuine intimacy. As she worked on lesson plans and he examined legal documents related to the property dispute, their shoulders touched occasionally, creating a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. "Read me something," he said suddenly, nodding toward the book of poetry she had set aside. She picked up the volume of Tennyson and turned to one of her favorite passages. Her voice was soft in the quiet room as she read aloud, and she was acutely aware of him listening, of the way his attention focused on her completely when she spoke. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Your voice is lovely," he said finally. "I could listen to you read all evening." The compliment sent heat flooding through her cheeks. "My students would disagree. They say I get too dramatic when I read stories aloud." "They're wrong," His voice was rough with an emotion she couldn't quite identify. "You bring the words to life." Later, as they prepared to retire to their separate rooms, Boaz caught her hand gently as she moved past him toward the stairs. "Abigail," he said, and there was something in his voice that made her heart skip. "Thank you for staying, for choosing to stand with me instead of seeking safety elsewhere." She looked up at him, this giant of a man who read poetry and worried about her safety, and carried his father's watch like a talisman against loss. "Thank you for giving me something worth standing for." He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles, just as he had on their wedding day. But this time the gesture felt different, less formal, more intimate, charged with the growing connection between them. As she climbed the stairs to her room, Abigail carried with her the memory of his touch, the warmth in his eyes when he looked at her, the growing certainty that their practical arrangement was transforming into something deeper and more precious than either of them had dared to hope for. Outside, the November wind howled across the prairie, carrying with it the promise of winter storms and unknown challenges. But inside their home, something fragile and beautiful was taking root, growing stronger with each passing day. The forgery was discovered in the most unlikely of places, stuck between the pages of a book on cattle breeding that Abigail had borrowed from the church library. She had been looking for information to help her better understand Boaz's work, when the folded paper fluttered out, landing at her feet like a message from fate itself. At first glance, it appeared to be just another land deed, the kind of legal document that seemed to multiply like weeds in a territory where boundaries were constantly shifting and claims overlapping. But as her teacher's eye, trained to spot discrepancies and forgeries in student work, examined the document more closely, she noticed several troubling inconsistencies. The paper was aged, certainly, but the ink seemed too dark, too fresh. The handwriting, while attempting to mimic the formal script of official documents from 20 years past, had subtle characteristics that marked it as much more recent. Most damning of all, the surveyor's seal bore a name she recognized, Thomas Hartley, who had only been licensed in the territory for 3 years. Her hands trembling with the implications of what she was holding, Abigail gathered her skirts and ran across the prairie toward the north pasture, where Boaz was working on fence repairs. The wind whipped her hair from its careful bun, and her breath came in sharp puffs in the cold air, but she didn't slow down until she reached him. "Boaz," she called, holding up the document, "you need to see this." He straightened from his work immediately, sensing the urgency in her voice. When she pressed the paper into his hands, his expression grew darker with each line he read. "Where did you find this?" he asked quietly, but there was something dangerous in his tone that made her step closer to him instinctively. Between the pages of a book from the church library, hidden like someone meant to retrieve it later but forgot. She watched his face as understanding dawned. "It's a fake, isn't it?" The deed Blackwood showed the surveyor. "More than fake." His voice was steady, but she could see the anger building in his eyes like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. "This is a practice copy. Look here." He pointed to corrections in the margin, places where someone had tested different variations of the forged handwriting. Whoever made this was perfecting their technique before creating the final version. The implications crashed over Abigail like a cold wave. "He's been planning this for years. The claim on your land, the threats, all of it. Longer than that, I think." Boaz folded the document carefully, his movements deliberate and controlled. "My father died 20 years ago this month, right here in this pasture, working alone, no witnesses. I was 17, grieving, overwhelmed by trying to run a ranch I wasn't ready for. If someone had wanted to alter property records, steal land, cover up a crime, that would have been the perfect time." The words hung between them, heavy with terrible possibility. Abigail felt sick as the full scope of Marcus Blackwood's deception became clear. This wasn't just about land or money. It was about murder covered up with forged documents and decades of patient planning. "We have to tell someone," she said. "The sheriff, the territorial authorities." "With what proof?" Boaz's laugh was bitter. "A document that proves someone practiced forging a deed? That's not evidence of murder, Abigail. It's barely evidence of fraud." "Then what do we do?" Before he could answer, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Marcus Blackwood was riding toward them with 4 men, all armed, their faces grim with purpose. Abigail moved instinctively closer to Boaz, and she felt his arm come around her protectively. "Cutter," Blackwood called out as he reined in his horse 20 feet away. "I've come to give you one last chance to be reasonable about the north pasture. Sign over the deed and there won't be any unpleasantness." "The answer is the same as it was yesterday," Boaz replied calmly, but Abigail could feel the tension in his body, like a coiled spring. "This land belongs to me and it's staying with me." Blackwood's eyes shifted to Abigail, and she didn't like what she saw there, a calculating coldness that made her skin crawl. "Even if it means putting your pretty little wife in danger." The threat was unmistakable, and Abigail felt Boaz's arm tighten around her. But instead of the fear she expected to feel, she found herself filled with blazing anger. How dare this man come to their home, threaten their life together, try to take what they were building with lies and intimidation? "You're wasting your time, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice carrying all the authority she used when dealing with unruly students. "We know about the forged deed. We know you've been planning this fraud for years." The color drained from Blackwood's face, and his hand moved instinctively toward the gun at his hip. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Abigail pulled the practice document from Boaz's hand and held it up. Thomas Hartley's seal on a deed supposedly 23 years old when he's only been licensed for 3. Handwriting that looks suspiciously like yours, Marcus. Corrections in the margins where you practiced your forgery. Blackwood's composure cracked completely. "Give me that paper." "So you can destroy the evidence?" "I don't think so." She tucked the document into her bodice where it would be safe from grabbing hands. "This is going to the territorial authorities, along with a full account of your attempts to defraud my husband." "Your husband," Blackwood snarled, his mask of civility falling away completely. "You think he told you the whole truth about your precious practical marriage? Ask him about the night his father died, about what really happened in this pasture." Abigail felt Boaz go rigid beside her, but she kept her eyes fixed on Blackwood. "What are you talking about?" "His father didn't die of a heart attack," Blackwood continued, his voice ugly with malice. "He died because he was too stubborn to accept a reasonable business proposition. When I offered to buy this pasture at a fair price, he refused. When I suggested we could resolve our differences privately, he threatened to go to the sheriff." Blackwood's smile was cold as winter wind. "So I helped him understand that some decisions can't be taken back." The confession hit like a physical blow. Abigail heard Boaz make a sound deep in his throat, something between a growl and a sob, and she realized they had just heard a man admit to murder. "You killed him," Boaz said, his voice barely human. "I defended myself when he attacked me," Blackwood replied smoothly. "Unfortunately, his heart couldn't handle the strain of physical confrontation. By the time I could get help, it was too late." It was a lie wrapped in just enough truth to provide legal protection, Abigail realized. Blackwood was confessing, but in a way that could be explained as self-defense if it ever came to court. "And then you spent 20 years forging documents to steal his land," she said, her teacher's mind putting together the pieces of his long deception, waiting until his son had a wife to threaten, something precious that could be taken away. "Nothing personal against either of you," Blackwood said, his reasonable tone at odds with the guns his men were now openly displaying. "Just business. Land is valuable, and I saw an opportunity to acquire some at a reasonable price." "Murder and fraud," Abigail said coldly. "Your definition of reasonable business practices." Blackwood shrugged. "The frontier is a dangerous place. Accidents happen. People disappear. Young widows sometimes decide to leave painful memories behind and start over elsewhere." The threat was clear, and Abigail felt ice run through her veins. But alongside the fear, she felt something else, a fierce determination to protect the life she and Boaz were building together, to stand against this man who had already destroyed so much. "You made one mistake, Marcus," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "What's that?" "You assumed I was the kind of woman who could be intimidated." She looked directly at him, letting him see the steel in her eyes that had sustained her through 8 years of frontier teaching. "You were wrong." For a moment, something like uncertainty flickered in Blackwood's expression. Then his face hardened again and he gestured to his men. "We'll see about that. You have until sundown tomorrow to sign over the deed to the north pasture. If you don't, your husband might have an accident just like his father did. And pretty young widows, well, they sometimes need comforting in their grief." He wheeled his horse around and rode away with his men, leaving Abigail and Boaz standing alone in the disputed pasture. The forged document seemed to burn against her chest where she had hidden it, evidence of crimes that stretched back 20 years and promised to reach into their future if they couldn't find a way to stop Marcus Blackwood once and for all. "He killed my father," Boaz said quietly, the words torn from deep inside him. "Yes," Abigail replied, taking his hand in hers, "and now we're going to make sure he pays for it." That night, Boaz disappeared into the barn and returned with a gun case Abigail had never seen before. Inside, nestled in worn velvet, lay a Winchester rifle that had clearly seen considerable use. His hands were reverent as he lifted it, checking its mechanisms with the practiced ease of someone who knew weapons intimately. "I hoped I'd never have to touch this again," he said quietly, not meeting her eyes. "Carried it for 3 years in the army before I came home to take over the ranch. Swore when I mustered out that I was done with killing." Abigail watched him clean and load the rifle, his movements economical and precise. This was yet another side of the man she had married, not just the gentle rancher who read poetry and built bookshelves, but a soldier who had seen combat, who understood violence in ways she could barely imagine. "You don't have to do this alone," she said, surprising herself with the words. He looked up at her then, his expression a mixture of tenderness and pain. "Abigail, you can't be part of this. If something happens to me, nothing is going to happen to you." She moved to the gun case and pulled out a smaller weapon, a pistol that fit more comfortably in her hands. "And I'm not letting you face Blackwood and his men without backup. You don't know how to use that. Then teach me." Her voice carried the same determination that had sustained her through 8 years of frontier teaching, the same strength that had helped her build a life from nothing after her broken engagement. "I'm not hiding in the house while my husband fights for our future." For a long moment they stared at each other across the kitchen table, the weapons between them representing choices neither had wanted to make. Then Boaz reached for the pistol, checking its action with the same careful attention he had given the rifle. "Basic principles first," he said, his voice taking on the patient tone of an experienced instructor. "Never point it at anything you don't intend to destroy. Always assume it's loaded. Keep your finger off the trigger until you're ready to shoot." They spent the next hour in the barn, using hay bales as targets while he taught her the fundamentals of marksmanship. Her hands shook at first, not from fear, but from the weight of what they were preparing for. By the end of the lesson, she could hit the center of a target more often than not, though her ears were ringing from the noise and her arms ached from the unfamiliar motions. "You're a natural," Boaz said as they walked back to the house, and there was pride in his voice alongside the worry. "But shooting at hay bales is different from shooting at people who want to kill us," she finished. "I understand, but I won't let fear make me useless when you need me." The next morning brought visitors. Dr. Morrison, Reverend Matthews, and 3 other men from town, all armed and grim-faced. Abigail watched from the kitchen window as they spoke with Boaz in the yard, their conversation too low for her to hear, but their purpose clear from their postures. When Boaz came inside, his expression was lighter than it had been since Blackwood's threats began. "Word's gotten around about what happened yesterday," he said, settling into his chair at the kitchen table. "Seems Blackwood's been making enemies in town for years." Dr. Morrison remembers some suspicious injuries among Blackwood's hands, men who asked too many questions or knew too much. Reverend Matthews says 3 families have left town suddenly after disputes with Blackwood over land or water rights. He took her hand across the table, warm and steady. "They're going to help. They're going to stand with us. This isn't just about our ranch anymore. It's about stopping a man who's been terrorizing this whole county for decades." The plan they developed was simple but effective. Blackwood's deadline was sundown, and they were betting he would come to enforce it personally, bringing his hired guns to ensure compliance. The men from town would position themselves around the ranch house, creating a crossfire that would make it impossible for Blackwood to retreat once the shooting started. "What's my role?" Abigail asked. "You stay in the house, safe, while we handle this," Boaz replied, but his tone suggested he already knew what her response would be. "No." She looked around the table at the assembled men, her voice carrying all the authority she used in her classroom. "This fight started because Blackwood thinks he can intimidate a woman. Thinks I'm a weakness he can exploit. I won't hide while you risk your lives to protect me." Dr. Morrison cleared his throat awkwardly. "Mrs. Cutter, with all due respect, this isn't work for a lady." "With all due respect, Doctor," she interrupted, "I've been taking care of myself on this frontier for 8 years. I can shoot, I can think clearly under pressure, and I have as much right to defend my home as anyone else at this table." The men exchanged uncertain glances, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of a woman in combat. But Boaz was looking at her with something like admiration in his eyes. "She's right," he said quietly. "This is her fight too, and she's proven she won't be intimidated or pushed aside." Reverend Matthews shifted uncomfortably. "It goes against nature, a woman in a gun battle." "What goes against nature is murder disguised as business," Abigail replied sharply. "Marcus Blackwood killed my husband's father and has spent 20 years profiting from that crime. If you think I'm going to cower in a corner while he threatens to do the same thing to Boaz, you don't know me very well." The discussion continued for another hour, but eventually the men agreed to include her in their plans. She would position herself in the upstairs window of the house, where she could see the approach from the main road and provide covering fire if needed. It wasn't the front lines, but it was participation, and it acknowledged her right to fight for the life she and Boaz were building together. As the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, the men took their positions. Dr. Morrison behind the barn, Reverend Matthews and 2 others in the small grove of cottonwoods near the creek, the remaining man in the loft, where he could see in all directions. Boaz remained in the yard, visible and apparently alone, though Abigail knew he had the rifle within easy reach. She settled herself at the bedroom window, the pistol loaded and ready in her hands. From this vantage point she could see the road stretching away toward town, empty now but soon to carry men intent on violence and theft. The waiting was the hardest part. As the shadows lengthened and the temperature dropped, Abigail found her mind wandering to the changes in her life over the past months. 6 months ago, she had been resigned to spinsterhood, content with her small, safe existence as the town school teacher. Now she was married to a man she was falling in love with, preparing to fight a gun battle against murderers and thieves. The irony was not lost on her that Marcus Blackwood's threats had accomplished something he had never intended. They had forced her and Boaz to depend on each other, to move beyond the careful boundaries of their practical arrangement into something deeper and more precious than either had dared hope for. A movement on the road caught her attention. Riders approaching, 5 men, heavily armed, Marcus Blackwood unmistakable in the lead. Abigail felt her heart begin to race, but her hands remained steady on the pistol. Whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine not just their physical survival, but whether the life she and Boaz were building together could continue to grow. She watched as they drew closer, saw the confident way Blackwood sat his horse, the casual violence suggested by his companion's postures. He thought this would be easy, an intimidated rancher and his frightened wife, surrendering valuable land rather than risk a fight they couldn't win. He was about to learn how wrong he was. "Be careful," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if the words were meant for Boaz, for herself, or for the fragile but growing love that had surprised them both with its strength and its promise. The school bell Abigail had borrowed from the schoolhouse sat on the windowsill beside her, its brass surface gleaming in the late afternoon sun. It would be her signal to the men positioned around the ranch. 3 quick rings when Blackwood and his riders came within range, 2 more when the shooting started. She didn't have to wait long. Marcus Blackwood rode into the yard like a conquering general, his 4 hired guns spreading out in a practiced formation that spoke of experience with this kind of intimidation. They were confident, relaxed, clearly expecting no real resistance from a rancher and his schoolteacher wife. "Cutter," Blackwood called out, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "Time's up. You ready to be reasonable, or do we have to make this unpleasant?" Boaz stood in front of the house, his hands loose at his sides, the Winchester rifle leaning against the porch rail within easy reach. From her position at the window, Abigail could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he balanced his weight, ready to move in any direction at a moment's notice. "I told you yesterday," Boaz replied, his voice calm and steady. "This land stays with me. It belonged to my father, and it belongs to me." "Your father's dead," Blackwood said with casual cruelty. "Has been for 20 years. Time to let go of the past and face reality." Abigail's hand tightened on the school bell. The men were close enough now, well within the range they had discussed. She lifted the bell and rang it 3 times, the clear bronze notes carrying across the prairie like a warning. Blackwood's head snapped up at the sound, his eyes searching for the source. "What was that?" "That," said Dr. Morrison, emerging from behind the barn with his rifle trained on the nearest hired gun, "was the sound of your luck running out, Marcus." The transformation was immediate and electric. Blackwood's men reached for their weapons but found themselves facing gun barrels from 3 directions as the townsmen emerged from their positions. Reverend Matthews stepped out from the cottonwoods, his usual gentle demeanor replaced by grim determination. The other men appeared from their hiding spots, all armed and ready. "Seems you're outnumbered," Boaz said, finally reaching for his Winchester and bringing it to bear on Blackwood himself. "Maybe you should reconsider your position." For a moment the tableau held, 10 armed men facing each other across the ranch yard, tension crackling between them like lightning before a storm. Abigail held her breath, knowing that the next few seconds would determine whether this ended with words or violence. Then one of Blackwood's men, a lean, dangerous-looking individual with scars on his face, made the decision for everyone. His hand darted toward his gun, and the yard erupted into chaos. Abigail rang the school bell twice more, the signal for battle joined. Though the gunfire that erupted made any further signals unnecessary, she brought her pistol up, sighting on one of Blackwood's men who was trying to flank Dr. Morrison, and squeezed the trigger. The recoil surprised her. stronger than she had expected, but her shot was true. The man spun and fell, clutching his shoulder, his own weapon flying from his grasp. She had never shot another human being before, and the reality of it hit her like a physical blow. The responsibility, the irreversible nature of violence, the way it changed everything in an instant. But there was no time for reflection. Below in the yard, Boaz was moving with the fluid grace of a trained soldier, using the porch for cover as he worked his rifle with deadly efficiency. One of Blackwood's men was down permanently. Another was wounded and trying to crawl to safety. But Marcus Blackwood himself had dismounted and was stalking toward the house with murder in his eyes. "Come out here, Cutter," he shouted, his composure finally cracking completely. "Face me like a man instead of hiding behind that school-teaching wife of yours." The insult sent rage flashing through Abigail's chest. She leaned out the window, her pistol trained on Blackwood's center mass. "I'm not hiding," she called down to him. "I'm right here." Blackwood's head snapped up, and for a moment their eyes met across the distance. She saw surprise there, and something that might have been respect before his face hardened again. "Should have minded your own business, school teacher," he snarled, bringing his own gun up to bear on her window. But Boaz was already moving, lunging from the porch with a roar of pure rage that seemed to shake the very air. "Don't you dare point that gun at my wife!" The two men collided in the center of the yard with bone-jarring force. Blackwood's shot going wide as Boaz tackled him to the ground. They rolled in the dust, grappling for control of their weapons, and Abigail realized with growing horror that she couldn't get a clear shot without risking hitting her husband. Around them, the battle was winding down. Dr. Morrison and the other townsmen had subdued or scattered the remaining hired guns. But the real fight, the personal war between Boaz and the man who had murdered his father, was just beginning. Blackwood was smaller than Boaz, but wiry and desperate, fighting with the vicious cunning of a cornered animal. He managed to break free from Boaz's grip and scrambled backward, his gun coming up again. "Should have died with your father," he screamed, finger tightening on the trigger. The school bell was still in Abigail's left hand, its weight solid and reassuring. Without conscious thought, she drew back her arm and hurled it with all the strength and accuracy that 8 years of playground supervision had given her. The brass bell struck Blackwood in the side of the head with a resounding clang, sending him staggering sideways just as his shot went off. The bullet intended for Boaz's heart passed harmlessly through the air where he had been standing a moment before, and then Boaz was on Blackwood again, this time with no interference, no weapons between them, just two men settling a debt that was 20 years overdue. The fight in the yard was brutal and decisive. Blackwood, dazed from the school bell's impact, could not match Boaz's combination of size, strength, and righteous fury. Within moments, he was pinned to the ground, Boaz's hands around his throat. "This is for my father," Boaz growled, his voice barely human. "For every year you let me believe he died of natural causes. For every night I wondered if I could have saved him." Blackwood's face was turning purple, his legs kicking weakly as he struggled for air. Around them, the other men watched in grim silence, understanding that this was justice being served, not murder being committed. But Abigail could see something in her husband's face that terrified her, a darkness that spoke of a line about to be crossed, a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life, regardless of how justified it might be. The soldier in him, the part that had seen too much violence already, was taking control. "Boaz," she called from the window, her voice cutting through the red haze of his rage. "Don't. He's not worth damning yourself." For a moment his grip tightened and she thought he might not hear her. Then his eyes found hers across the distance and she saw the man she had married fighting against the darkness of his past, love warring with vengeance in his expression. Slowly, his hands loosened. Blackwood gasped and wheezed, drawing desperate breaths, but he was alive. "You're right," Boaz said. his voice thick with emotion. "He's not worth it." He looked down at the broken man beneath him. "But he is going to pay for what he's done." Dr. Morrison stepped forward with rope from his medical bag, and they bound Blackwood securely while he was still too dazed to resist effectively. The forged deed Abigail had discovered, along with Blackwood's own confession in front of witnesses, would be enough to see him hanged for murder and fraud. As the adrenaline of battle began to fade, Abigail found herself shaking with reaction. She set the pistol carefully on the windowsill and hurried downstairs, desperate to touch her husband to reassure herself that he was whole and unharmed. He met her at the bottom of the stairs, his arms coming around her with desperate strength. For a long moment, they held each other without words, both trembling with the aftermath of violence and the knowledge of how close they had come to losing everything they were building together. "I thought he was going to kill you," she whispered against his chest. "I thought he was going to shoot you out of that window," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "When I saw him point that gun at you. But he didn't. We're both here. We're both alive." Dr. Morrison cleared his throat respectfully. "We should get Blackwood to town, turn him over to the sheriff before word gets out and someone decides to take justice into their own hands." As the men prepared to transport their prisoner, Reverend Matthews approached Abigail with something glittering in his hands, her mother's wedding ring, which she realized she had never actually worn. "I found this on the ground," he said gently. "Must have fallen from your things during the fight." She stared at the simple gold band, symbol of dreams she had thought were lost forever. Then she looked up at Boaz, this man who had given her not the passionate romance she had once imagined, but something deeper and more lasting: partnership, respect, and love that had grown from practical beginnings into something precious and true. "Would you put it on my finger?" she asked him quietly. His hands were gentle as he slipped the ring into place, his eyes never leaving hers. "With this ring," he said softly, echoing words from a ceremony they had never truly had, "I thee wed, not from convenience or necessity, but from love." "From love," she repeated, and the words felt like a vow more sacred than any they had spoken in the church. The sun was setting over the prairie, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold, as Marcus Blackwood was loaded into Dr. Morrison's wagon for the journey to town and justice. His decades-long reign of terror finally ended. "It's over," Boaz said, his arm tight around Abigail's waist as they watched the wagon disappear down the road. "No," she replied, looking down at the wedding ring that finally rested where it belonged, on the hand of a woman who had found the love she thought would never come. "It's just beginning." 6 months after Marcus Blackwood's trial and execution, Abigail stood in the doorway of the nursery that Boaz had built onto their home, her hands resting on the gentle swell of her belly. The baby's cradle sat in the corner, crafted from prairie oak by her husband's skilled hands, its surface smooth as silk and strong as the love that had created it. Spring had come early to Redfern Ridge, and through the nursery windows, she could see the kitchen garden they had planted together, blooming with new life. The carrots and beans were thriving, the herbs sent their fragrant promise on every breeze, and the small apple trees Boaz had surprised her with were heavy with blossoms. "Talking to the little one already?" Boaz asked from behind her, his arms coming around her to rest his hands over hers on their unborn child. "Telling him about his father," she replied, leaning back against his solid warmth. "About the man who builds cradles and plants gardens and reads poetry by firelight." "Him?" Boaz's voice held gentle amusement. "You sound very certain about that. A mother knows these things." She turned in his arms, marveling as she did every day at the way this giant of a man could be so tender, so careful with the precious things in his life. "Besides, you wanted strong sons to guard our winters, remember?" His expression grew soft with memory and wonder. I remember a lot of things from that day. How terrified I was that you'd refuse. How certain I was that I was asking too much of you. You weren't asking too much, she said, reaching up to trace the lines around his eyes that spoke of laughter shared and burdens eased by partnership. You were offering me everything I thought I'd lost forever. The sound of children's voices from the schoolhouse carried on the morning air, reminding her that in an hour she would need to ring the school bell. The same brass bell that had once served as her weapon, but had returned to its proper purpose of calling young minds to learning. She had continued teaching throughout her pregnancy, with Boaz's full support and the community's blessing, and would do so until their child needed her more than her students did. Do you ever regret it? Boaz asked suddenly. Giving up your independence, tying yourself to a rancher you barely knew? Abigail considered the question seriously, as she had many times over the past months. The woman who had signed that practical contract seemed like a stranger now, resigned to loneliness, convinced that love was a luxury she could never afford. I regret wasting so many years believing I wasn't worthy of this, she said finally. I regret all the time we might have had if I'd been brave enough to hope for something better than mere survival. And I regret thinking that practical arrangements were safer than risking my heart, he replied, his hands moving gently over the curve where their child grew. Turns out love was the practical choice all along. It just took me 35 years to figure that out.